Imagine waking up one morning as an ordinary teenage girl, and before the day ends, you're told you are now the Queen of England. Not because you fought for the throne, not because the people chose you, but because powerful men secretly decided your fate behind closed doors. Now imagine that only 9 days later, everything is gone. Your crown, your freedom, and eventually, your life. This is the tragic story of Lady Jane Grey, remembered throughout history as the 9-Day Queen. A girl barely old enough to understand the brutal politics surrounding her, yet forced into one of the deadliest power struggles England had ever seen. She lived during the terrifying Tudor era, a time when kings executed wives, queens destroyed enemies, and entire families were erased over religion and power. But what makes Jane's story different is this. Unlike many rulers throughout history, she never truly wanted power. In fact, many historians believe Lady Jane Grey may have been one of the greatest victims in royal history. She was intelligent, deeply religious, highly educated, and completely trapped, used like a chess piece in a game controlled by ruthless adults. Her story contains betrayal, fear, manipulation, political conspiracy, and one of the most heartbreaking executions in English history. And centuries later, people still debate the same question. Was Lady Jane Grey really a queen? Or was she simply sacrificed by the people around her? Tonight, we uncover the shocking true story of the teenage queen who ruled England for only 9 days before losing her head. Lady Jane Grey was born in October 1537 into one of England's most powerful noble families. She wasn't born a princess, but she was close enough to the royal bloodline that her future would always be dangerous. Jane was the great-granddaughter of King Henry VII, the first Tudor king. That connection placed her near the line of succession to the English throne, and during Tudor times, being near the throne could be deadly. England under the Tudors was a brutal world. Power meant survival, and survival often required betrayal. Jane grew up surrounded by wealth, privilege, and royal influence, but her childhood was far from happy. Unlike many young noblewomen of her time, Jane was extraordinarily intelligent. She loved studying languages, philosophy, and religion. Historical accounts claim she could speak Latin, Greek, and Hebrew while still a teenager, something almost unheard of for women during the 1500s. She became known as one of the most educated young women in England. But behind her intelligence was loneliness. Jane's parents, Henry Grey and Lady Frances Brandon, were extremely ambitious. They wanted status, power, influence, and many historians believe they treated Jane less like a daughter and more like an opportunity. One famous story reveals just how unhappy Jane's childhood really was. A scholar named Roger Ascham once visited Jane and found her reading quietly while everyone else was hunting outside. When he asked why she preferred studying alone, Jane reportedly confessed something heartbreaking. She said that whenever she was with her parents, she lived in constant fear. If she smiled wrong, spoke wrong, walked wrong, or even looked wrong, she would be punished harshly. According to Jane, reading books was the only thing that brought her peace. Imagine that, a teenage girl finding comfort in books because her own home terrified her. That pressure shaped Jane's personality. She became quiet, serious, deeply religious, and emotionally reserved. But she also became obedient. And in Tudor England, obedience could become a weapon used against you. As Jane grew older, powerful people began noticing her more carefully. Not because of who she was, but because of what she represented. A possible path to the English throne. And soon, England itself would enter a crisis that would completely destroy her life. To understand how Lady Jane Grey became queen, you first need to understand the chaos left behind by King Henry VIII. Henry VIII famously had 6 wives and 3 surviving children: Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. When Henry died in 1547, his only son Edward became King Edward VI at just 9 years old. But Edward was sickly from childhood. By his teenage years, his health had become extremely poor. And by 1553, everyone around him realized something terrifying. The king was dying. Edward VI was only 15 years old. England now faced a massive succession crisis. Legally, the next ruler should have been Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's eldest daughter. But there was one enormous problem. Mary was Catholic. Edward VI and many powerful nobles were fiercely Protestant. They feared that if Mary became queen, England would return to Catholicism and undo years of religious reform. For some nobles, this wasn't just politics, it was survival. One of the most powerful men in England at the time was John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. Northumberland effectively controlled the government during Edward's reign, and he understood something very clearly. If Mary became queen, his own power could disappear overnight, possibly along with his life. So Northumberland began creating a dangerous plan, a plan involving Lady Jane Grey. Jane was Protestant, young, connected to the royal bloodline, and perhaps most importantly, easy to control. Northumberland moved quickly. He arranged for Jane to marry his son, Guilford Dudley. The marriage itself was deeply political. Jane reportedly did not want the marriage at all, but refusing powerful men in Tudor England was nearly impossible, especially for young women. Then Northumberland pushed even further. He convinced the dying King Edward VI to bypass Mary and Elizabeth entirely, and instead name Lady Jane Grey. 4 days after Edward's death, Lady Jane Grey was summoned to Sion House near London. She had no idea what awaited her. Inside the house stood some of the most powerful men in England: nobles, government officials, church leaders, and her own family. Then came the shocking announcement. They informed Jane that King Edward VI was dead, and that she was now Queen of England. Historical accounts say Jane was horrified. Some reports claim she fainted. Others say she burst into tears. Think about that moment. A 16-year-old girl suddenly realizing she had been placed at the center of a political war that could easily end in execution. Because Jane understood the danger immediately. She knew Mary Tudor would never quietly accept losing the throne. And she knew many people considered Mary the rightful heir. Jane reportedly argued that the crown legally belonged to Mary, but her family and advisors pressured her relentlessly. Some historians believe Jane felt she had no real choice. Refusing the crown could anger the powerful men around her. Accepting it could make her a target for the entire kingdom. Either way, she was trapped. Finally, under enormous pressure, Jane accepted the crown. On July 10th, 1553, Lady Jane Grey was officially proclaimed Queen of England. Cannons fired. Royal announcements. Mary Tudor moved with incredible speed. At first, Northumberland believed he could easily crush her rebellion, but he completely underestimated how much support Mary actually had. Every day, more nobles abandoned Jane and joined Mary. The political winds shifted almost overnight. And in Tudor England, loyalty was often temporary. People supported whoever looked most likely to survive. Northumberland marched out with troops to stop Mary before her army grew stronger. But morale among his men was weak. Many soldiers secretly sympathized with Mary. Some didn't trust Northumberland. Others feared being labeled traitors if Mary won. Meanwhile, Jane remained isolated in the Tower of London, surrounded by uncertainty and fear. Imagine being 16 years old, knowing armies were moving across England because of you, knowing thousands could die, knowing that if the wrong side won, your life was over. Then came the betrayal that destroyed everything. The government in London, the very officials who had proclaimed Jane queen, suddenly switched sides. The Privy Council abandoned Jane and declared Mary the rightful queen instead. Just like that, Jane's reign ended. 9 years. Only 9 days after becoming Queen of England, Lady Jane Grey lost the crown forever. Crowds in London erupted in celebration for Mary Tudor. Church bells rang across the city. People cheered in the streets. Meanwhile, inside the tower, Jane reportedly heard the celebrations and realized exactly what had happened. She was no longer queen. She was now a prisoner. Northumberland was arrested almost immediately. Soon afterward, he was executed for treason. The powerful man who had engineered Jane's rise fell quickly once his plan failed. But Jane's fate remained uncertain. Queen Mary entered London triumphantly, and surprisingly, she initially showed mercy toward Jane. Mary likely understood that Jane had been manipulated by powerful adults. She saw Northumberland as the true villain, not the frightened teenage girl he had used. At first, Mary spared Jane's life. Jane and her husband Guilford were imprisoned in the tower, but execution was delayed. There was still hope. If events had ended there, Lady Jane Grey might have survived. But Tudor England was far too unstable for mercy to last.
In early 1554, disaster struck again. A major uprising known as Wyatt's Rebellion erupted against Queen Mary. The rebels opposed Mary's planned marriage to Philip of Spain and feared growing Catholic influence in England. But there was another dangerous factor. Some rebels wanted to replace Mary with Lady Jane Grey. Even though Jane herself had little involvement, her very existence remained a threat. As long as Jane lived, she could become the symbol of future rebellions. And Mary knew it. Imagine Mary's position. She had already survived one attempt to steal her throne. Now rebels were once again using Jane's name. Keeping Jane alive suddenly looked incredibly dangerous. Mary faced an impossible decision: show mercy or secure her throne permanently. Eventually, she chose survival. The execution orders were signed. Lady Jane Grey would die. She was around 16 or 17 years old, still practically a child. While imprisoned, Jane spent much of her time reading religious texts